when Jason Miller received a shocking demand from the Maplewood HOA to hand over the keys to his own garage. He realized his privacy and authority were under threat. Karen Whitmore, the icy and overconfident HOA president, expected blind compliance, treating his home as if it were hers to control. But Jason had a clever surprise waiting. His garage, transformed with drones, lights, and a custom security system, left her panicked and dialing 911. Just wait until you see how he turned this blatant intimidation into a stunning victory and why justice ultimately prevailed. Jason Miller had always taken pride in his home. From the freshly painted shutters to the meticulously raked lawn, every corner of his suburban property reflected hours of dedication and careful planning. For him, his house wasn't just a structure. It was a sanctuary, a place where he could unwind after long days at work and feel a sense of control in a world that often felt chaotic. But on that Thursday morning, that sense of peace was shattered before he even had his first cup of coffee. A crisp envelope stamped with the familiar logo of the Maplewood Homeowners Association lay on the welcome mat. Jason frowned as he picked it up. He had received HOA notices before, mostly about landscaping issues or minor regulation reminders, nothing that demanded immediate attention. But as he opened it, his stomach sank. The letter demanded the keys to his garage and property, insisting that inspectors needed urgent access that very day. There was no polite request, no explanation beyond a vague sense of authority, just a direct order as if his consent was irrelevant. Jason felt his chest tighten. He reread the words, incredulous. Urgent access. For what? He had never received a complaint about his property. Everything was up to code, neat and orderly. His thoughts spun rapidly, bouncing between disbelief and frustration. The idea that someone could assume such power over his private space without warning felt not just unfair, but invasive. He imagined the inspectors walking through his home, pawing through his personal belongings, all under the guise of authority. The sheer audacity of it made his blood boil. By the time he stepped outside to take a deep breath, there was a knock at the door. It was Karen Whitmore, the HOA president. She stood there with her clipboard tucked under her arm, her expression unreadable, the kind of professional detachment that masked a surprising level of confidence. But to Jason it looked more like a calculated display of dominance. She smiled politely, almost mockingly, and said, "Good morning, Mr. Miller. I am here to collect the keys. We have a schedule to maintain and the inspection cannot be delayed." Jason's fingers tightened around the door frame. He opened his mouth to protest, to explain that this was an unreasonable demand, but Karen continued before he could get a word in. "As HOA president, I have the right to enter any time. Your cooperation will make this easier for everyone," she stated, her voice cold and measured. There was no room for negotiation in her tone, no acknowledgement of his ownership, just an assertion of authority. For Jason, that moment was electric. The anger surged through him like a shockwave. It wasn't just about a letter or a knock at the door. It was about respect, about boundaries, about the principle that a private citizen should not have their autonomy dismissed so casually. He imagined the countless homeowners who had probably acquiesced to similar demands without protest, letting bureaucratic overreach slide because confrontation seemed daunting. But he wasn't going to be one of them. As he took a step back, processing the intrusion, his mind replayed the past few months, small annoyances from the HOA that now seemed like breadcrumbs leading to this confrontation. A notice about his mailbox that had arrived 2 days late. A request to trim a bush that had never caused an issue. A community-wide email implying subtle judgment for minor aesthetic differences. It all converged in that moment, turning what might have been a routine encounter into a deeply personal affront. Jason's thoughts raced. This is my property, my home, my sanctuary. And now a stranger, emboldened by bureaucratic authority, was trying to dictate how he should surrender control. The anger wasn't just irritation, it was a fire consuming the usual patience and forcing a sharp clarity. This wasn't just paperwork, it was an attempt to impose power over someone who had done nothing wrong, and Jason wasn't going to accept it. He squared his shoulders, locking eyes with Karen. There was no fear, only a simmering determination. This confrontation would not be one-sided. The letter, the knock, the assertion of control, they had crossed a line. And Jason knew with an unshakable certainty that he would not back down. Not today, not to anyone. By the time the door clicked shut behind Karen Whitmore, Jason Miller's anger had begun to simmer into something heavier, darker, and more unsettling. The fire of indignation still burned, but now it was mixed with a gnawing anxiety that tugged at his chest. What if this escalated? What if Karen, unflinching in her authority, called the police for refusing entry? Jason had never been in trouble with law enforcement. He had always followed the rules, paid his dues, and maintained his property with care. The thought of being questioned, of being forced to hand over the keys to his sanctuary, sent a cold shiver down his spine. He paced the living room, staring at the envelope that now sat ominously on the counter. The bold words, "urgent access," seemed to mock him. He thought of the whispers he had overheard from neighbors at community events. Stories of homeowners who had been harassed into submission, their complaints dismissed, their objections minimized, and in some cases their personal spaces invaded. The HOA wasn't always a friendly oversight committee, he realized. It could wield authority in ways that felt frighteningly unchecked. And now, that same power had come knocking on his door. The hours crawled by. Jason's thoughts refused to relent. Each imagined scenario was worse than the last. He pictured the police arriving, expecting him to cooperate, while Karen pointed to her clipboard like a shield of legitimacy. He envisioned endless explanations, disputes over codes and bylaws, neighbors watching from across the street, wondering if he had somehow done something wrong. His mind replayed every word from the confrontation earlier in the day. Karen's calm, measured voice cutting through his defense, her eyes cool and calculating. The confidence she carried now felt like a taunt. As night fell, sleep became impossible. Jason lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, the shadows from the streetlights slicing through the blinds, tracing lines across his walls. His body was tense, muscles stiff from hours of pacing and worry. The injustice of the situation pressed down on him like a weight he couldn't shake. This wasn't just a disagreement over a minor issue. It was a challenge to his autonomy, a violation of the unspoken trust between homeowner and home. His house, the place that should have been a refuge, now felt fragile, threatened by forces he hadn't invited in. In the quiet of his bedroom, he tried calling friends. Each conversation ended with sympathetic murmurs, a shared sense of disbelief at the HOA's aggressiveness, but little else. "That's outrageous," said one. "I'd never let them do that," said another. Jason appreciated the empathy, but it only emphasized his isolation. Even well-meaning advice couldn't give him the reassurance that the threat would actually end. The creeping dread returned with every passing minute, pressing against the edges of his rational mind. He began to imagine worst-case scenarios, his privacy violated, his belongings exposed, his sense of security shaken. It wasn't merely fear. There was grief, too, a subtle mourning for the peace he had always taken for granted. His home had been a private world, a space where he could control every detail, and now that control was questioned. He felt betrayed not by Karen personally, but by a system that allowed a single person or committee to assume such authority over another. Trust, security, and dignity, the pillars of his sense of home, felt suddenly fragile. By the early hours of the morning, Jason sat on the edge of his bed, hands clasped, staring at the floor as if the wood could offer some grounding, some solution. Anxiety gnawed relentlessly, but beneath it all, a seed of resolve began to take root. He understood in the pit of his stomach that he could not ignore the situation. But in that moment he had yet to see a path forward. The pain of helplessness was sharp, unrelenting. For Jason, this was more than a conflict. It was an assault on the sanctuary he had built with care, and the weight of it pressed on him like a tide, leaving him restless, unsettled, and painfully aware that his battle had only just begun. The night stretched endlessly, every sound in the house amplified, every shadow a reminder of the intrusion he feared might return at any moment. And though Jason could not yet see how he would reclaim control, one truth was undeniable. He could not allow this violation to go unanswered. Morning sunlight spilled over Jason Miller's lawn, crisp and calm. Yet he felt a tension simmering beneath the surface that he couldn't shake. The previous day's confrontation with Karen Whitmore and the Maplewood Homeowners Association had left him restless and determined. He had spent the night turning over every possible scenario, weighing the risks and planning a way to reclaim control without surrendering to fear. By sunrise, clarity had taken root. He would not simply hand over the keys or allow intimidation to dictate the outcome. Instead, he would use preparation, intelligence, and a touch of ingenuity to change the balance of power entirely. Jason's mind raced as he went through the plan step by step. He knew Karen and her assistant would arrive expecting compliance, subdued resistance at most. They had underestimated him, assuming that politeness or routine would force him to yield, but Jason was not going to be predictable. For months, he had been quietly working on projects in his garage, installing custom lighting, fine-tuning sound equipment, building drones, and setting up a sophisticated security system. Until now, these projects had been personal, experimental, almost obsessive hobbies. Today they would serve a higher purpose. By the time the familiar knock sounded at the front door, Jason had transformed the garage into a showcase of unexpected power and precision. He opened the door with calm deliberation, greeting Karen and her assistant with an expression of composed neutrality. "Good morning," he said simply, as if nothing unusual had occurred. His tone was calm, deliberate, and measured, yet underneath it lay a quiet confidence that spoke volumes. Karen's eyes flicked to the garage, and her assured posture faltered just slightly. Jason pressed the remote in his hand, and the garage door began its slow, deliberate ascent. Sunlight streamed over the polished floor, bouncing off equipment and casting shadows that danced across the walls. The room inside had been transformed beyond expectation. Rows of custom-installed lights pulsed in coordinated patterns. Speakers hidden along the walls emitted a carefully tuned hum. Drones, each designed and built by Jason himself, hovered in formation, motioning almost like silent sentinels. In one corner, a network of sensors and control panels glimmered, part of a security rig he had assembled piece by piece over the past several years. Karen's confident demeanor, so commanding yesterday, shattered in an instant. Her eyes widened, her mouth parting slightly in disbelief, and for the first time, Jason saw panic flash across her face. The clipboard dropped from her grasp as she took a cautious step back. Her assistant, equally stunned, muttered something incomprehensible, clearly caught between surprise and concern. Jason's heart surged, not from triumph yet, but from the recognition that he had seized control of the situation without confrontation, without raising his voice, without breaking any rules. Karen fumbled for her phone, her fingers shook as she dialed 911, her voice rising into a pitch of urgent alarm. "There's a suspicious setup here," she stammered. "It looks like a security threat." Jason remained calm, leaning slightly against the doorway, watching as her composure unraveled. She had expected compliance, passivity, or perhaps confusion. Instead, she encountered deliberate preparation. A calculated display that turned the anticipated narrative upside down. As he stood there observing the unfolding chaos, Jason felt an unfamiliar emotion swell inside him. Hope. Not merely the hope of defending his property, but the hope of exposing the HOA's recklessness, of showing his neighbors that intimidation could be met with intelligence and preparation rather than fear. The air of authority Karen wielded so easily the day before had vanished, replaced by uncertainty and hesitation. Jason realized that the moment of vulnerability he had anticipated and meticulously prepared for was now his greatest advantage. The realization was liberating. For months, the anxiety, the fear, and the pressure had threatened to crush him. But this morning, every late night and every hour of careful planning converged into a single decisive action. He had reclaimed his sense of control. The future was no longer a passive waiting game. It was an opportunity to assert boundaries, to expose truths, and to act with precision. Hope, Jason understood, was not a passive feeling. It was an active choice, fueled by readiness and courage. And with that, he took a measured step forward, ready to face whatever came next. The distant wail of sirens grew steadily louder, cutting through the tension that had hung in the air for what felt like hours. Jason Miller remained calm, his posture relaxed as the police car rolled up the quiet Maplewood street. Karen Whitmore, still clutching her phone, glanced nervously over her shoulder while her assistant shifted uneasily on the sidewalk. The morning's chaos had left them uncertain, and now, under the eyes of law enforcement, their confident authority was beginning to crumble. Two uniformed officers stepped out of the patrol car, badges gleaming in the sunlight, and approached the scene with measured steps. Jason greeted them politely, explaining that everything inside the garage was entirely his property and completely legal. His tone was calm, almost matter-of-fact, as he described the custom lighting, the drones, the sound system, and the intricate security setup he had built over the years. There was no threat here, no danger, just a homeowner exercising his rights and pursuing his passions. Karen, who had expected the police to side with her, instantly hesitated. Her usual composure was gone, replaced by a faint flush and a nervous tapping of her fingers against the clipboard. The officers, professional and neutral, began a careful inspection. They moved systematically, checking each element of Jason's setup. Drones hovered as designed, sensors blinked rhythmically, lights pulsed according to programmed sequences, and every device had proper documentation and safety measures in place. It quickly became clear there was nothing suspicious, nothing illegal, nothing that justified alarm. As the officers concluded their inspection, Jason could see the shift in the dynamics. Karen's confident posture had entirely collapsed. She looked at Jason, then at the officers, and finally down at the ground. Her assistant mirrored her reaction, eyes wide and unsteady. The officers addressed her politely but firmly, explaining that the setup posed no danger and that Jason had every right to maintain his property as he saw fit. The implication was unmistakable. The attempt to intimidate him had failed, and her authority in that moment was completely undermined. Jason felt a rush of quiet triumph. Weeks of anxiety, months of planning, and countless hours spent honing his projects had culminated in this precise moment of vindication. The injustice he had faced, the presumptuous demand for keys, the implied threat, the intimidation, had been met with intelligence, preparation, and calm resolve. Not with anger alone, but with foresight and courage. He realized that this wasn't just about winning a confrontation. It was about reclaiming control over his life, his home, and his sense of self-respect. Word of the incident spread quickly through the Maplewood community. Neighbors who had silently endured similar interactions with the HOA began to take notice. Conversations sparked at weekend gatherings, messages circulated in local social groups, and Jason became an unexpected symbol of resilience. People admired not only the cleverness of his response, but the composure and dignity with which he had handled the situation. He had shown that it was possible to stand firm without escalating conflict, to protect one's rights while remaining calm and respectful. The incident became a lesson in vigilance and self-assertion. Homeowners started paying closer attention to HOA communications, questioning overreach, and documenting interactions to protect themselves. Jason's story inspired a broader awareness in the community about personal boundaries and the importance of thoughtful, proactive planning. What had begun as blatant injustice ended as a triumph, a vivid reminder that courage and intelligence can turn moments of violation into opportunities for empowerment. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across his lawn, Jason stepped back and looked at his home. The garage, once a simple workspace, had become a symbol of resilience. He had not only defended his property, but had done so in a way that upheld his principles and integrity. In that moment, he understood something deeper. True triumph isn't just about overcoming a challenge. It's about transforming fear and uncertainty into a reaffirmation of dignity and strength. Neighbors passed by, giving nods of recognition, smiles of admiration, and subtle gestures of solidarity. Jason felt a quiet pride, tempered with humility, knowing that his actions had set an example. The message was clear: vigilance, preparation, and unwavering composure can turn even the most audacious attempts at intimidation into validation, inspiration, and lasting respect. What began as a confrontation with injustice had become a story of empowerment, a narrative that would linger in the neighborhood long after the morning had passed.